So Michael is both a family therapist and a Killam professor at social work at Dalhousie University, Maritimes, shout out. He is currently the network director of the Children and Youth Challenging Context Network and co-founder of the Resilience Research Center that coordinates more than $5 million in funded research in a dozen countries. He travels a lot, so we're very, very grateful that he's here in town. That research is focused on resilience among children, youth, and families, and how together they survive adversity in culturally diverse ways. He has published over 100 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters on this topic and is the author of 11 books. I think Arlene has a whole shelf. I think it's all signed, and there's little, not rosary beads, I'm not sure what she puts on them. It's all very interesting. A little creepy. In addition to his research and writing, Michael maintains a small family therapy practice in association with Phoenix Youth Programs, a prevention program for street youth and their families, and was the recipient of the 2012 Canadian Association of Social Workers National Distinguished Service Award. So congratulations on that. His blog, Nurturing Resilience, can be read on Psychology Today's website, so make sure you look that up if you haven't. But you don't have to do that today because we have him right in front of you, and you can hear him as long as the squeals from the audience of Arlene's Bieber-like fan don't get in the way. So Michael Ungar, please join us. Thank you.
Well, that's just embarrassing enough. Give me just a second. I'm just going to escape out of that and make sure I can bring up another presentation for you folks. And find that little toggle. And that should do it. And I'm going to do this because I have a feeling this is going to block me. This is impressive. Peter, we had some contact maybe quite a few years ago, maybe about 5, 6 years ago. And I was saying when he picked me up at the airport, it felt like the little engine that could. I mean, there was this growing commitment to young people here in, certainly across Alberta, but certainly here in Edmonton. I know Peter Smith, who's counted always as a cherished colleague, was doing some remarkable work with youth, really grassroots, on the streets, reaching out, enacting programs that seem to be instilling resilience to some of the most hard-to-reach young people. Excuse me. And that's the kind of inspiration that I take for my work. So what I'd like to do today, actually, because I know some people may have heard me speak before, I kind of wanted to bring here some pretty, if you will, I wanted to add some depth to this idea of resilience and what it is and how we can actually, in a sense, diagnose resilience. Rather than diagnosing psychopathology and disorders, which is somewhat where we get so caught up with when we end up in those case conferences on quote-unquote high-risk youth, as opposed to youth who show incredible promise with the right resources given to them. So what I wanted to do was just bring to you today some of my emerging thinking, as best as I can convey it, to really give you a sense of some of the leading edge ideas as we are trying to reach out and understand resilience. And in the workshop, I'll just basically apply those ideas to more clinical practice. But for this, I wanted to give more of a survey. So I thank you very much for this opportunity to share some emerging ideas. Like most of the work, though, you get these long introductions, thank you very much, but really it's the kids and the families, right, that are ultimately our teachers. I'm not sure if you feel much the same way. And a little while ago, I was actually consulting about a young man. He was 13 years old, just had turned 13 years old, and he wasn't going to school. He was becoming a chronically truant young man. There was all kinds of talk that he was refusing to engage with his support staff. He had resisted any sort of interventions from child welfare. There were mental health concerns because of past trauma, which I'll get into in a second. And basically, this was the sort of the psychopathology, the diagnosis of disorder that was being presented to me as the person who had to work with him. And what the story actually, as it emerged, came out was that what had happened was when he was 12 years old, which is about a year before this team that I was consulting with had met him, what had happened was that he had come home, and his father had been chronically depressed and had a chronic and persistent mental illness that had led him to several suicide attempts over the years. And eventually what had happened was this boy had come home from school and had sensed that there was something wrong, gone down into the basement of his house, and found his father hanging himself. Fortunately, he hadn't killed himself. And it was the boy who had to sort of get underneath the dad, as he described it, and lift his dad up to get him to come out of the rope. And then he was able to call 911, and you know, the whole sort of tumble effect after that of getting dad back to hospital. Now, what was interesting was that subsequently after that, the mother just said, I'd had enough with this. I can't deal with this man anymore. She'd put up with a fair bit over the years. And she took herself and the boy's younger sister, and as well as the boy, and she moved out, leaving the father. And the boy would have none of it. He said back to his mother, look, I'm going to stay with Dad, because if I leave, then Dad will die. Dad will kill himself, for sure. And so the boy did that. And any day that the boy, sensed that his father was particularly despondent or depressed, he would stay with his father at home and refuse to go to school. And as the months went on, of course, this became more and more of a pattern, because the boy became more and more anxious that his father was again going to kill himself. He was, in a sense, parentified. We could psychopathologize his behavior. We could say very clearly that what he was experiencing was not the kinds of behavior that we would really value for our children. That being said, there was nothing anybody could do to force the boy to go to school. And eventually, what the team began to understand was, rather than seeing this as a problem, why don't we just simply acknowledge that this boy is doing something incredible? Why don't we work with him from a more of a strengths perspective? Why don't we acknowledge that this is his unusual pattern to resilience? And what we negotiated with him was, we said to him, what do you need to go to school? And he simply said, in a very coherent way, he said, I'll go to school if you can guarantee that my father will be alive when I get home. Now that seems perfectly reasonable in terms of a negotiation. So what the treatment team then had to do was figure out how they're going to do that. And they realized they had to start leveraging the psychiatric team at the local hospital to basically put resources in so that there would be resources for his father during the day to monitor him. He wasn't an inpatient. He wasn't going to be in an inpatient program. Now, this continued to go on, and then we realized that the boy was not convinced that he was actually influencing the process yet. So what he asked for was, he wanted to be on the psychiatric team. Now imagine this. You go to the local hospital where you have an adult who has a chronic and persistent mental health problem, who's on medications, who's dealing with the psychiatric nurses and the psychiatrists and everything else, and you basically go to them, and as your intervention to prevent a child welfare intervention and to prevent another problem with truancy at school, your intervention is to go to the psychiatric team at the hospital and say, we want this 13-year-old boy on his father's psychiatric consultation team. That was a tough sell. That was a tough sell, because everyone went, you want what? No, we don't admit children into these meetings. We have all these silly rules. It's as if somehow, when Moses came down from the mount, there was an 11th tablet that said, thou shalt not let 13-year-olds into psychiatric consultations, or something stupid like that. There was like chiseled in stone rules that just seemed needing to be changed. So we changed them, because they weren't chiseled in stone. And all of a sudden you had now an empowered 13-year-old boy who was keeping his father alive, who was telling the psychiatric team what they needed to hear in terms of his father's mental health condition. And it worked. The boy was finally convinced that someone was listening, and in that process began to change his behavior, felt more secure, less anxious, less parentified, and began to go and have a normal life. Began to go back to school finally. Now, what for me is interesting about that story, as I could tell many, many such stories, having learned from young people themselves, is that you see this pattern, this difference between this model of mental health, this two-factor model, right? Is that we can get so caught up, it seems, on trying to suppress disorder, trying to address the truancy. Or we could have, let's face it, a lot of people would have said to that boy, why don't we send you for trauma counseling? Why don't we just, shove you into another therapeutic intervention? And the boy's main concern would have been totally missed. His main priorities would have been overlooked. His voice wouldn't have been heard. So what I'm beginning to understand, what's really of concern to me, is I don't want to just simply suppress disorder, this one dimension of mental health, which is whether there's disorder, whether you have ADHD, conduct disorder, anxiety disorders, or some other sort of neural developmental challenge or whatever. I don't just simply want to deal with that. I want to help people build capacities for empowerment, voice, relationships, attachments, a sense of power, control, and all kinds of other things in their life that will carry them through crisis into the future. Now, in a sense, what I'm saying is that we, and I mean all of us in this room, we are actually the ones making people resilient. And that is such a flip from this Oprah-esque kind of culture that we have, in which I think sometimes we think that resilience is something just inside the individuals. But I'm going to tell you, it's not. The research is very clear on this, that while a small amount of change is accountable by individual qualities, in fact, most of what makes us resilient, the vast majority of it, comes from our families, our mentors, our communities, our schools, and of course, the vast networks of social services that are there for us in times of crisis. We seem to want to mythologize the individual, the strength of the individual. But what we've forgotten is that no individual story unfolds without incredible resources and hope and inspiration and social safety nets and healthcare systems and psychiatric care services and all those other things that actually make it possible for youth to survive well. So, I'll give you a small example of that. This is some simple data from a study, not my own research, but some research done in British Columbia. And what it basically shows is that if you work with a group of young people who have shown signs of, who report histories of child abuse and sexual abuse, and you'd agree, if you know kids like that, they tend to report much more suicidal ideation. This is true? Everyone would agree with that. Well, here's an interesting thing about the intervention. If you ask those same youth, not only about your suicidal ideation, but if you ask them also to talk to you about whether or not they feel engaged at their school. In other words, has somebody reached out to them and made them feel like they belong at their school, that they feel comfortable there? And if you do that, what you see is a very steep decline in their suicidal ideation. Now, this is an interesting one, because what it says is that as you increase school engagement, which is more of a factor related to resilience, is more of a social determinant of well-being, a contextual factor, the more you increase that, the less suicidal these young people will be. Now, it's not that I don't think trauma counselors are important. Don't get me wrong at all. But what I am trying to say is that resilience can also be instilled in people the more we create contexts and environments in which they are given the resources that they need. So I tend to define resilience in that case in a way that says, you know, when there is significant exposure to adversity, that resilience is our capacity of individuals to navigate their way to the psychological, social, cultural, and physical resources that sustain their well-being, and their capacity individually and in groups to negotiate for those resources to be provided in culturally meaningful ways. Okay, that's a lot of words. It's much easier just to say, like Oprah, oh, you're strong, right? You have something magical inside of you, or something like that. But I just sort of boil this down to two rather simple words, which is navigation and negotiation. And the reason I do that is because what I'm trying to say, of course, is that when we structure environments around young people, when we actually make it possible for them to find the things that are meaningful to them, like the 13-year-old boy whose father was suicidal, my argument is that we can create resilience by structuring environments, by changing environments around young people so that they essentially get what they need in ways that make sense to them. And that's, admittedly, I mean, if you look at great programs like, I know the work you're doing, Peter, and I know many other people here in Alberta, when you actually look at what the programs that are functioning the best, they usually have both that ability to put in front of young people what they need, but to have negotiated on their own terms outrageous programming that actually makes sense to them. I was doing a consult in Calgary a couple years ago, and I remember vividly we got into a case discussion about a young woman who, Aboriginal young woman from one of the First Nations communities outside of Calgary, who they were having trouble engaging. It seemed her treatment team, she was showing a lot of high-risk behaviors related to, I believe there was some drug problems, there was some early high-risk sexual activity, et cetera, and the treatment team realized that this young adolescent actually had an amazing capacity for art, which is neat, right? And this was something that she seemed to really want to flourish on. So what they did was, the treatment team sort of strategized. I remember vividly having this conversation. They kind of strategized, and what they eventually said, well, why don't we get her hooked up with some art classes? And so they arranged at the YWCA, or one of the institutions, so that the girl could go to do art classes. And she went down, and for a few weeks she attended, and she drew her little still life, flowers and all kinds of other things, and she drew lovely little pictures and everything else. And she'd bring them home to her parent, her mother, who just didn't kind of get it. You know, her daughter was showing up with these lovely paintings, these lovely things from that the girl had been doing in what was essentially a white institution. And it wasn't matching. So the family was kind of going, well, that's kind of interesting, so you can draw those things, that's cool. But the reaction, the response was so little. So anyways, we rebooted that. And I remember vividly that the suggestion was, well, why don't we get her involved more with an Aboriginal artist? And this notion of not just putting in front of a kid a resource, but making sure it matches, is so important. Because once this girl started attending one of the Native Friendship Centers and actually learning a form of art that was more relevant to not just to her culturally, but also to her extended family. And she came home with another painting, this time a stylized sort of drawing in the sort of the tradition of our Canadian, of Native peoples here in Canada, was the stunningly different reaction from her parents. The community. All of a sudden, those were the paintings, those were the pictures that got passed around the community. And suddenly, this identity flourished in the presence of this opportunity to convey something that made sense to those around her. Now, what I'm actually beginning to understand then is that there are ways of understanding these patterns of resilience so that we can make them more intentional. And I'm going to go out a little bit on a limb with the psychiatric community, because I think we can actually diagnose resilience. And the first part of that diagnostic criteria, though, and this is some of this new stuff that I'm just beginning to sort of work on. So I wanted to sort of bring it as sort of like the fresh produce, if you will. The first dimension of this is we really need to account for the adversity. And I'm going to argue that unless you're accounting for the adversity that young people are experiencing, you're going to have a really hard time understanding their patterns of resilience. So I tend to think in terms of course, the severity of what they've experienced. Is it one very, very brutal assault? Or is it more an issue of chronicity in which there is persistent neglect over time? You also have to account for the ecological level at which the risk factors occur at. And this is the complexity. Is this just at the level of an individual signs of early psychosis for a child who lives in a very well-resourced middle-class family in the suburbs next to a hospital? Or is this a case of there's also cultural issues? Is this family experiencing some sort of trauma from a past war where if they're immigrants? All these different ecological levels, from the individual right up to the socio-political, have to be accounted for when we try to understand the risk exposure that someone has. We also have to account for their attributions. In other words, when they are experiencing the risk, do they say, oh, it's all about me, I'm a failure, this risk is about me, it's just about, it's personal? Or do they attribute this to their whole community? Do they attribute this, apologies to politicians, to the governments, of course? Or do they attribute this just to their family's own individual failings? These are important questions to ask any child when you're assessing risk. And of course, the cultural and contextual relevance of the risk. Let's face it, to some extent, and I say this very, very cautiously, poverty is relative. It's it's how you feel vis-a-vis others around you. But also, so are trauma events as well. When you're in the midst of a very dangerous community where there's a lot of war, you desensitize. It's not that long-term you may not experience the traumatic after effects, but we cannot simply say that one event categorically is going to cause trauma or not. It's very, very much about what you experience. You know the stories, for instance, that the children during the London blitzes in the World War II, the studies were quite clear that the children who were taken away from their parents to be safer, right, suffered more trauma afterwards than the children who experienced the bombings themselves. Because we have to understand that sense of powerlessness, the breach of attachments. What is contextually relevant to a child is not the bombs, it's the attachment, it's the breach of that trusting relationship with a parent. That would be far more traumatic than simply the visuals of watching buildings fall. So we sometimes have to think about these stuff. I'm going to then say that when we're actually assessing resilience, to add some complexity to this, we have to understand that whether or not someone's in a high risk or highly risk exposed environment or a very low risk exposed environment. And it changes because in the lower risk environments, things like temperament and personality factors and your ability to think through problems, IQ, all those things count a lot more. They do. They really do. The child in a lower risk environment who has just a few risk factors and has all those sort of personal talents, they're going to get through life really well. That's what the research says very clearly. But if you go into a higher risk environment where you're in a marginalized, racially marginalized community, where that community is traumatized by a cultural genocide, war, persistent poverty, exclusion, if you have yourself living in a community where chronically there's gun violence or something like that, you are not necessarily going to be able to be resilient just on temperament factors alone. You're going to need a facilitative environment of hope and help. You're going to need early exposure to all that early education, and all those early education, the early childhood education. I think McEwen is actually one of the leaders in the country in terms of training teachers in that area. All those interventions are going to count a lot more for the more marginalized, the more disadvantaged populations. And that's why we've sort of messed this up on some of our understanding of universal programming. I like universal programming. I get it. I get it. But I will say this. We've goofed it up sometimes. We've forgotten that, in fact, sometimes we're giving resources where they don't count at all, right? And I think we have to kind of straighten this out, that sometimes targeted interventions and targeted use of our limited economic resources are much better than ubiquitous programming. Can I be political? Am I allowed to be political for like 10 seconds? You know the whole sort of way we've approached childcare for at-risk families in this country, right? We goofed it up. I don't care how you vote. I don't care what side of this, I don't care what your ideology is. I'm just going to give you some raw science on this one. I don't care what government took this on, but they goofed this up. When we started giving everybody a small child tax credit of $100 a month per child, it was a complete waste of money. There's not a shred of research that says that that will influence the outcomes of children. All it does is put us further into deficit financing. There's not one study anywhere in the world that says that giving money to higher income, lower risk families does anything for child overall well-being. But I will give you this truth. We know there are hundreds of studies that show that if you get children from more vulnerable families into high-quality daycare systems prior to their 5th year, when they enter the school system, and that you increase their language and their school readiness, they actually do a whole bunch of things later in life, right? And you know these. We diagnose learning disorders quicker. We prevent child abuse, sequelae, much better because most child abuse is identified at what age? Age 5, 4, 6, when these children hit systems, right? We also, by the way, prevent children from ending up in the juvenile delinquent programs that we have in this country. And we also prevent mental health disorders and everything else, and we keep them in school longer. Every single one of the facts I just listed is attributable to early interventions in children's lives. They cost money, absolutely. But the research is very clear that that investment plays a social dividend that could return, for every dollar invested at the front end, it gives us $7 at the other end. That seems to be the truth. What is no truth is, why do we give families $100 a month? If someone can just explain that to me, I would be more than happy. And I don't care what your government does. I don't care which side of this equation you're on. I just know that when we look at the factors that make us resilient, I want to make to people who are at risk, I want to make resources available and accessible. I want to make sure that people have access to the resources they need when they're in crisis. And I want to basically, when they're doing something that might appear negative, like maybe resisting or holding their children back from school, as sometimes happens in Aboriginal communities, in some immigrant communities, in some communities that are marginalized by past traumas. When you see those patterns, I think that the onus is on us to sometimes understand that those patterns of behavior can actually make sense in those particular contexts of people who themselves have long histories of problems. So when I'm looking at this notion of assessing resilience, I guess what I'm simply saying is we have to make resources available and accessible to people in ways that make sense. And for the people who are most disadvantaged, we will have the biggest impact by the work that you do. There is a differential impact to what we do in terms of how we reach out. So a police officer who walks down the street and catches a kid who's usually leery of cops, actually catches a kid doing something well, or the S4 program in Calgary that actually puts police officers in uniforms in elementary schools, I'm going to argue that that's a nice thing to do. But it's especially nice for the kids who are being raised in contexts where police are suspicious creatures to them, and their parents and their extended families. In those contexts, I'm going to argue you really are going to see a huge impact. And of course, resilience has sort of multidimensional considerations. It has socio-historical ones, right? The one I always like to tell, and this is borne out, right? If you're a kid with a learning disorder, and you're just feeling awkward and stupid, and you get up to about grade, I don't know, grade 8, 9, 10, 11, whatever. And, you know, if you're living out here in Alberta and you can drop out of school and somehow get yourself a job in the oil patch or something, if that's possible, you might find that you can actually buffer the negative impact on your self-esteem by actually leaving school. Now, that's not the case. I'm in Halifax. You don't leave school until you have like 3 university degrees, and only then do you get a job in Halifax, right? Or you come out to Alberta, right? But the truth is that in certain contexts, in certain temporal periods, in certain socio-historical periods, right, what you're going to experience as a pathway to resilience is going to be, it's just simply going to change. That we're going to have to see that. So let me rather than just talking these points, let me actually show you a brief video. This is a video that we prepared as a sort of a training video, and it's of a young boy. His name is Brian. He's 16 years old. He ran away from home. He's been street involved for several months. He eventually got into a shelter, and he's been given a sort of a permanent placement in a shelter so that he can actually cope with the violence at home. This is what the problem facing him is. When he goes home, he has a father who's away a fair bit. I believe he was a truck driver. But when the dad's home, there's a lot of violence. The boy is not only verbally abused, but there's also the threat of physical violence. This boy left home. Now, here's the interesting thing. Because let's focus on resilience as opposed to disorder. He sometimes carries a knife to school. He does that when other kids taunt him with comments, like that. You know, whenever they criticize him, he feels really anxious, right? So he gets triggered. So he will carry a knife to school to protect himself, which of course then, what happens? He gets caught. The school threatens to get him out of school. The more they threaten to get him out of school, the more he jeopardizes his placement at the youth shelter, because they say that either you go to school, you work, but you can't just simply hang out here. So he is literally, because of this constant triggering and all these other problems, he's actually at risk of losing his education. If he loses his education, then he'll lose his housing as well. So there's a whole bunch of problems coming up for this kid. Now, what's interesting was the worker that you're going to see, the counselor that you're going to see working with him, her name is Allison. Eventually, she gets it, that this kid is coping as best he can and that the shelter makes more sense than being at home. Then she asks to meet with his mother as well, so that she puts the mother and the boy in the same room. And she tries to figure out, okay, what is this kid's pathway to resilience? Given that if I assess his risk factors, if I assess his strengths of personality, if I look at what resources are realistically available and accessible, if I look at all those factors around and the community in which he lives, does it make sense for this kid to go home? He's 16 after all. Or does it make sense for us to permanently maintain him in a shelter away from his home and actually work at some other solutions? And this is essentially what Allison does. I just want to sort of see if I can show you this tape for a second and then discuss it here. Now, if it's going to work.
Brian and I decided that it would be helpful to invite you into a meeting to come and talk to us. Brian, you've talked to me about, one of the hardest things for you at home is when your dad's on the scene, and that's a time when there seems like there's a lot of tension, and you've used the terms like people are kind of, on edge.
Bugs me when we fight. I don't like it. It's worse when he's around.
And that's when the fighting is bigger between you and your mom at that time, right? And Janet, you kind of noted to me, you agreed with that things seem to be a lot more stressful when Alfred's home, but also you also have some concerns that this is sort of an ongoing thing between the two of you as well. Did you relate to anything that Brian was saying about kind of sometimes the fear that he feels around Alfred's anger and the worry and concern that he has for your safety? Was there any part of that that you kind of went, yeah, I kind of understand that?
Of course. And you have to understand that I've been with Al for many years. Mm-hmm. And I know better than anybody how much he cares about his family and how much he wants to do what's right. Al's always had a hard time controlling his temper. He was brought up at a time when people didn't think about those things. We didn't have anything to help us with things, and he was beaten with a belt, for God's sake. At least he just uses his hand with you. I mean, it's just not the same as it was for us. You don't understand.
I'm hearing that, that you're saying in many ways that, you're handling this situation in the best way that you know how. They were not looking at one option. It may be that, where Brian is 16, it may be that you two end up in a relationship with each other that's better if he doesn't live at home. It may be that we end up that it's okay that he go back home, but if it can't become safe, and really it's not your responsibility to make it safe, it's Al's responsibility, and if that can't happen, then maybe another solution, we look at some other solution of what would the new relationship between the two of you where he's not living at home look like.
I've lived by myself the last 2 months, and I've had a lot more time to myself, and I'm not living around you, I'm not living around Dad. I'm not living around the whole environment at home. I've got just myself, and I'm telling myself what to do, and it's worked out for me for the most part so far. I don't have anyone calling me stupid, being put down.
You're not stupid. And I've never called you stupid. Your father does not have the vocabulary to be able to say what he really means. You don't apply yourself. You don't try. You never have.
Okay, I think you kind of get the idea of what this boy is living, or at least I would imagine that should become pretty clear at this point. When I see tapes like that, what I'm beginning to understand is that we can make a boy like Brian more resilient. He can either carry knives to school, continue to have all the problems associated with the past episodes of abuse, or we can make him more resilient. And the neat thing about the programs that you're offering, and indeed I'll actually throw a carrot out, the really interesting thing about some of the government initiatives here in Alberta, whether it's the mental health programs related to the schools, or this very strong commitment to a conference like this, or simply the commitment to youth at risk through many, many, many communities here, is that what you're actually seeing is this understanding that by shaping environments around kids like Brian, we can actually make their lives that much better. And we know that this is a really great investment. If you look at the studies on the Adverse Childhood Experiences studies, the ACEs studies, that are proving that early episodes of child abuse have long-term medical consequences, whether it's sexual behaviors, addictions, mental health problems, obesity, heart disease. You see a dramatic pathway from early childhood experiences of abuse and future health consequences. We know that this kind of investment early on is going to actually make kids more resilient and give them what they need, that inoculation against future stressors. This is extremely clear. And when you look at a case like Brian, by presenting him with a shelter system which is flexible enough to meet his needs and cohesive enough to provide him with like counseling services and housing supports and educational supports and everything else, we're going to save Brian. And the real kid upon which that is based was saved. He didn't end up in jail. He didn't end up with a major mental health problem. He didn't end up with the child welfare system. He was put into a shelter. He maintained a positive relationship with his mother because that's what he was negotiating with us for, which is kind of neat, right? So he's in the shelters, but he maintains a connection with his home environment that is sustaining, that's mentally something that's really sustaining to him. And yet, he didn't go home. He couldn't go home. You heard the mother, right? Al just doesn't have the language to tell you that you're not stupid. This is an abusive man who's not taking responsibility necessarily to change his behavior. We protected Brian. We've made him more likely to do well in life. And it's that kind of pattern that is so, so critical. There's another way of sort of talking about this, because I think sometimes we've been hung up on thinking about kids' patterns in just one particular way. And the reason I wanted to raise this was because you work with a lot of different youth, right? And the typical thing is to look for strengths in a very narrow band of behavior. And typically, when we think about resilience, we think about this pattern here, this recovery pattern, right? Kids will, they start off at normal functioning, whatever that is, and then they hit chronic stressors and acute stressors, and chronic, they're racially marginalized, or they have some sort of episode of a single exposure to gun violence or a sexual assault of one episode or something like that. That's very, very traumatizing, and we tend to see they dip down in their psychosocial development, and then they come up and they recover back to normal levels, and we say, oh, they're resilient. But I'm going to suggest that there's lots of other patterns that you see if you go looking for them. One of them is simply this myth of the unaffected child. It's just an artifact of the research, actually, because what they do is they go to places like with child soldiers in Sierra Leone, where we also have a large project. We have a project right now right next to where the Ebola outbreak is, so we've actually had to pull our team out, actually, coincidentally. But when we're working in Kailahun, Sierra Leone, and you actually look at child soldiers issues there, what you see is sometimes studies are done in ways that simply say, if you've been a child soldier and you don't show signs of PTSD, you are unaffected and therefore resilient. And that's somewhat true, but I also like to think of, well, are you also engaged in your community? Do you have positive relationships? Do you have all the building blocks for mental health as well? Going back to that crisscross model that I sort of started with. There's other patterns as well. George Bonanno and his team at Columbia have shown that actually, and this is interesting, a lot of kids come through traumatic events and actually show very minimal impact. They don't tumble into despair. They come back through it. They cope. They hold on, right? If you look at the life histories for children who self-identify as gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgendered, two-spirited, queer, questioning, intersex, all that part of that rainbow, the bulk of those young people, if they get minimal supports and they wait it out, things get better, which I think is, if you look at the sort of the campaign that sort of emphasized that, right? That if you can get those kids older and connected into their communities a little bit later, that things do sustain, that there are sustaining resources for them later on in life, which is tragic that they have to experience all that early crap, but they eventually get through it. And so what we are actually seeing is in many communities, whether it's a rural and remote community in this country suffering from a downturn in the economy or the lack of farm jobs or whatever, you do see a tendency for many young people to still survive. And of course, if you want to make it onto Oprah, there's post-traumatic growth, right? Which is that sort of phenomenon of not just sort of coming back to normal, but you actually do something more with your life. And I imagine in a group this large, there's got to be people in this room whose lives show post-traumatic growth, where you've taken your early adversity, perhaps your experience in a foster home, and turn that into something that made your life that much better. And now you're in that mode of giving back to others. That is also a pattern of resilience, and largely supported because people who tend to reach that point always have in their narrative some inspiring mentor. It's the big brother, big sister phenomenon, right? It's that sort of, again, that service commitment through NGOs that populate our communities that make that extra commitment. It's that street youth worker who found the kid when they're just about to OD. It's that reaching out that actually often brings people through that moment of crisis and says, I can do better, and I'm going to sort of devote my life to being inspiring to somebody else. You can also, I guess, if you want to continue, now this is where it gets kind of controversial, right? Because you can also see in the resilience literature this pattern of avoidant behaviors. This is really interesting because, like for instance, and this is really kind of, again, a little controversial, children who are being abused by their parents, especially neglected, do better emotionally and from a mental health perspective, generally speaking, when they withdraw emotionally from the adults in their lives. Doesn't that make sense? So if you constantly try to evoke attention and all you get is sort of pushed back and pushed away, it makes you worse if you keep seeking out attention from adults. If you shut down emotionally, though, you actually may do better. So when we inherit youth who are leery of adult contact and actually emotionally withdrawn, is our tendency to see that as a pattern of resilience or a pattern of psychopathology? And what I'm going to argue is that in a particular context in which the environment is hopeless, that is a sign of resilience. There's another little piece to this, by the way. They've been doing some studies on soldiers who had served in Afghanistan and Iraq. These are American-based studies. And the very strange little bit of noise in this is that actually soldiers who have had experiences of being physically and or sexually abused as children, and who use this avoidance strategy, so they kind of shut down emotionally, they supposedly made great soldiers. Isn't this like one of those little sick bits of trivia that you really didn't really want to know? But supposedly these men and women make very good soldiers in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, where the violence is very indiscernible, where you do not know where the next attack is going to happen, which, if you think about it, is very much like a family that's very abusive, isn't it? You're never quite sure when dad or mom are going to get drunk or high, and all of a sudden there's going to be hell to pay in the home. Now, by the way, just to let you know, those same soldiers, they may do very well in the theater of war, but they do not do very well when they're demobilized and they have to become citizens of their communities again. They make lousy spouses. In other words, sometimes patterns of a pathway to resilience, if I continued these lines, they would diverge yet again. A pattern in time that's coping. If you get a kid coming into your service and they're using this avoidance strategy, it doesn't mean that they're reified, they're fixed there. What the research also says to us is they will change. They will change in response to you. There's a couple of other patterns too. There's this hidden or atypical pattern in which sometimes people do things like drop out of school. They avoid difficult situations if you have a severe learning disorder, right? If you're feeling culturally marginalized, or racially marginalized, you might actually withdraw from institutions where you feel like you cannot cope well or where there's simply no hope. I mean, if you don't have that promise that if you go to school, and there was a lot of interesting studies done with African Nova Scotians and African Canadians, for instance, that showed when kids do not perceive that if I go to school here, I will get the big job over here. If they see that as a broken social contract, school makes no more sense to them. And actually, dropping out might actually be a more credible pathway to resilience because it maintains your self-esteem. It gives you another way of being in the world. And of course, sometimes you just simply see maladaptive coping strategies. Let's face it, for some young women, I have a daughter, I have a son as well. I mean, you don't want to promote this, but you know, and I'm sure, how many of you have ever worked with a young woman who has said that she, in a sense, didn't choose to get pregnant, but she wasn't exactly that worried about it because for her, the pregnancy was a rite of passage. It was a way of sort of asserting her footprint in her community. It was giving her a higher status by being a mother, even if she is only 15 years old. Does that ring true for anybody in the audience? You know, so we begin to see these patterns of kids sort of staking out their territory in the best ways that they possibly can. And I'm going to simply suggest that the challenge for us then is how do we understand these different pathways that kids use? How do they make sense? A while back in one of the residential facilities I worked in, I worked with a young man. He was 17 and he was constantly up on charges for being violent, especially after he drank. He was from a very rural community, not unlike I'm in many of the communities that you have here in Alberta. And what was the problem was that he would drink heavily, and then, like all his extended family, this would be part of the pattern, and then he would usually be, because he was a tough kid, a big kid, he would get into fights. There were weapons offenses against him, there was assault charges against him, and they were almost always related to the drinking. So when he came into the institution, I thought, well, why would I psychopathologize this kid? I mean, sure, we did some detoxing and we tried to work with him on, some harm reduction strategies and all this kind of stuff, but we began. But the fundamental conversation that I had with him that was so impressive to me was rather than trying to say, okay, so you're drinking really heavily and that's causing you all these fights and everything else, and I began to ask him questions like, well, what else would you do? What else, if you weren't drinking on Friday and Saturday night with all your relatives and your extended family and everything else and all the other people who live on your road in this rural area, what would you do? And he was very, he just kind of threw it back at me and said, well, what the F would you do? And the answer was, I don't effing know, right? How would you handle living on that particular road in that rural community when everyone else is getting drunk on that particular night? What else do you do? So here we were setting him up to say, stop drinking, which was a completely stupid intervention because there was simply no other alternative, no other place for him to navigate, nothing else that he could negotiate for. So what I did was I began a conversation that was a little bit different with him, and I said to him, I'm curious, just tell me the history of alcohol in your family. Just help me understand how it fits in. Tell me about your context, your culture on this. And he told me this elaborate story of his great-grandfather dying in a snowbank when he was in his 60s. He came out of a bar in some rural community up around in the Maritimes of Canada, and he fell down in a snowbank, and nobody found him until the next morning, and he'd frozen to death. He was an alcoholic, obviously. He struggled with alcoholism all his life. I asked him, and then what about your grandfather? Because it was his great-grandfather. And I said, what about your grandfather? He said, well, my grandfather drank heavily and only gave up drinking in his early 50s. Really? Well, yeah, but he said, not before my granddad was a total asshole. He had, beaten his kids. He'd destroyed a couple of marriages. He'd ruined his business. He was a fisherman. He'd done everything wrong, basically, and largely attributable to the drinking. I said, wow. But he gave it up eventually. He said, yeah. So I said, well, what was your father doing with this? And he said, well, my father was a drunk as well. But, my father finally went to some AA meetings when he was in his mid-30s. Now, mind you, I grew up, and the kid told me about the violence in his home and what he had witnessed and what he had seen his father do to his mother, both all kinds of violence at the home and what Christmases were like and the torn trees and the broken presents. I mean, just the chaos that this kid had grown up in. But his father had finally shaped up when he was in his early 30s. I guess he'd finally realized that enough was enough and he didn't want to continue this. So I turned to the kid, and it was such an easy question to ask then, wasn't it? And I said to him, so when are you going to stop drinking? And the kid, I don't think he'd ever been asked that, like in that way, right? Because obviously there was a pattern here. And I was kind of hoping he'd say, well, right now would be a good one, you know? And instead what he said to me was, 25. I'm going to stop drinking when I'm 25. So of course you have to ask, why 25, right? And the kid says, well, I don't think I'm going to have kids, and I certainly don't want to get married before I'm 25. So I'll drink heavily until I'm 25, and then I'll stop, because I don't want to beat my kids, and I don't want to beat my wife, and I don't want to ruin my future. But I also don't have anything else to do on Friday and Saturday nights. That makes sense. Now, I'm obviously segueing into some, I mean, resilience and harm reduction strategies have a lot in common, right? They're really close bedfellows. They understand each other. But what I am getting is that when I begin to see the multiple pathways that young people will travel, it's easy to get stuck. That if someone's not functioning normally, that they're not resilient. But in fact, in different contexts and different spaces, resilience can look, well, resilience can look like many, many different things. Great. So let me just give you very briefly some of the things that I think predict resilience so that we can actually intervene. These 9 things keep coming up over and over again in the research that we've been doing and around the world. I'm talking like large populations of kids. We have one study now in New Zealand, South Africa, Colombia, China, and here in Canada with Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal communities. We have over 7,000 young people who are all involved with service providers. And what we see consistently is these different things coming out. And of course, kids need structure and consequences. Any of you work with a kid in an institutional or correctional setting, and I vividly remember this when the kids would say to me, you know, I just wish growing up that someone had given a damn about me enough to set some structures on me, some expectations. Has anyone ever heard that from a kid? And I'm talking like incarcerated youth who are, you know, major drug and alcohol challenges or whatever. Those kinds of kids will often say they wish someone had given them some structure, and in a sense, some reasonable consequences for their actions. But yet we don't do that very well, do we? We don't always anticipate what kids actually need. My son was completely changed topic here slightly. I change of interpretation of this, but my son was one of the co-pres of his high school in grade 12, and we live in, you know, I live in a, I don't know, reasonable middle-class community or whatever in the Halifax area. And these bunch of rather entitled young people were beginning to have food fights in the high school. Food fights at, like, you know, these are teenagers, these are older teens, and they're having food fights in this cafeteria, to the point where tables are getting overturned and cans of pop are being thrown and a teacher was hurt and all kinds of crazy stuff. And my son came home one day because he was on student council, and he said, yeah, we had another food fight, and of course we have CCTV cameras, so we know which of the kids in the school started the food fight. And I right away, because I'm just, you know, obviously a little bit, you know, hyper, I kind of said to him, well, so what did they do, Scott? What did they do to the guys who started the food fight? Wait, for instance, did they bring them in the next day and make sure that they were the ones that helped the janitors and the custodians in the school help clean up the tables? And did they have to sort of, you know, maybe what did you have them do? Like for 5 days, did they have to sort of be on custodial duties and cleaning up the cafeteria and all that kind of stuff? Huh? And he kind of looks at me and does that wonderful thing that teenagers do. They roll their eyes at you. Don't you love it when your kid rolls his eyes at you? You know, like they do that kind of thing to you? And I said, what did I say wrong? He said, Dad, they didn't do anything like that. They suspended them for 3 days. They suspended them for 3 days. What kind of consequence is that? How is that giving them structure and consequences? He says, well, Dad, we can't have them do the job of the custodian. I mean, for instance, there's health and safety rules. Our garbage is toxic substances. You can't have kids picking up other kids' garbage. That would be like a health and safety issue, if you can believe it, right? And then I said, what the? Anyways, and he says, yeah, and by the way, there's another issue, Dad. The unions. And I'm not anti-union by any stretch of the imagination, but this one seemed kind of whacked. Supposedly the unions have a thing that the kids would be doing union work, and therefore weren't allowed to do it. So you had health and safety rules and union stewards all complaining that the kids could not come back to school and clean up their own mess. Now, I don't know about you, but that just seems stupid. right? And then we begin to wonder why we create irresponsible young people. And I'm even going to go let me switch this a little bit. When we watch a kid, deface our community in one place, and then we send them for community service hours over here, my impression is that kids don't get it. Is that model of restitution, while I applaud that we should be getting kids to fix their mistakes, that's a priority, I do think that kids need structure and consequences that make sense to them better. There's other things that we see around the world, right? Not beyond these natural consequences. We also see parent-child connections for kids. But again, remember I've been talking about this almost like a differential impact. In more marginalized spaces, parents actually don't count that much. I know everyone wants to believe otherwise. But actually, when your parents are really the part of the problems, I mean, not that they want to be, but they're burdened themselves. Children, one part of the equation is a connection with an adult, a caregiver. Yes, it counts. But we don't have to hang all our hats on that one sort of peg to make kids' lives better. Because on this chart, we also see that lots and lots of other relationships appear. How many of you have ever worked with a kid who really bonded well with the janitor at the school? Who's really, that was the person who they really seemed to make the connection with. And there's something that through those relationships, whether it's a big brother, a big sister, a mentor, or whatever, there seems to be something that we find, which is the fifth thing, which is that powerful identity. And you mentioned John Travolta. I'll bring his spirit into the room a second time, maybe more in a positive light. I always think of identity as a bit the John Travolta effect, right? It's that, see, I'm going to date myself. I'm going to think of him more when he was doing Saturday Night Fever, dance moves and all that kind of stuff, in that white suit, and he was kind of walking down with the Bee Gees music behind him, and you know how the way Travolta can just strut, right? I always think of that as identity, that we want to give kids that opportunity to really strut. The school, going back to the same high school, I loved it when I watched my son would do some DJing work there too, and it was fascinating to see that he would get the kids who were often some of the really sort of kids on the fringe of the school, but they were often interested in the techie stuff. They were often some of the kids with even anxiety disorders, whatever. Some of the kids who were delinquents or whatever, but they didn't mind participating in the school if they were given something with some power, right? And what he would do is he would get these kids to lug these big speakers around. Those were the kids, there's something really powerful about being the boy or the girl who lugs those big speakers, stacks them, climbs up into the rafters to hang things. You know the kids I'm talking about, right? And they don't have to be visible up front. They don't have to do anything very big. But boy, I tell you, and if you ever go watch them, when they plug that speaker cord into that speaker and they make that, that sound, there is something John Travolta-like about them. There is that moment of saying, I've got the power here, right? And I think about how do we give kids those opportunities to really experience identities that are powerful. And the sixth thing we see consistently that makes kids resilient is, of course, a sense of control. It's that ability to say, I have some say over my world. When we were designing that intervention for the boy whose father had hung himself in the basement, these ideas were in our minds. We knew that if we could give that boy a sense of control over his world, that he would make better decisions for himself. But notice that I'm saying it, when we changed our environments and made it possible for him to experience what he needed to do well. A sense of belonging, religion, sometimes spirituality, a sense of place in your family, a sense that, when I get up in the morning, someone notices me. That's also a very powerful part of resilience. And again, it's something that, if I will, most of the street youth organizations that I know of go out of their way to make sure that if a kid doesn't show up for a while, that they reach out, they go find them. There's that, there is that capacity to say, where are you? There's that notion of you count somehow. That's an important draw for young people. Fair and just treatment is that social justice, which really defines simply, I want to be treated fairly in my community. No matter how I identify, by my skin color, by my sexual orientation, by who my family is, where I live, wherever, I want to know that I'm going to be treated fairly based based on who I am, or that I can be treated fairly. And of course, psychological and physical safety always come out. It's very, very difficult for young people to do well without all these 9 things. Now, if you think about it, what I'm really talking about is juggling 9 balls in the air, sort of like a Cirque du Soleil act without the actual balls, because then I really couldn't do this if I tried it. But you kind of get people sort of doing this kind of juggling act. And our challenge then seems to be, how do we juggle all 9 of these and actually give kids the opportunity to experience what they actually need in terms that make sense to them? It's interesting. One of our research projects is up north with the Inuit in Labrador. And when we went into communities and asked kids, well, what do you need to feel a part of your community? The kids themselves told us, we want to learn our language. We want connections with elders. We want the capacity, the skills to go back on the land and hunt. These are the words of the kids themselves, these young Inuit. They wanted a sense of their cultural space. They didn't want to be simply marginalized within the white culture. They wanted to have something powerful to say about themselves, and they wanted relationships, not just with parents, but they've strongly said they wanted connections to their tribal group, their clans, their elders. That's a story that's echoed all around the world. And it's remarkable that when you begin to think about this as a constellation of things, we make a mistake as programmers. I will say this, I will criticize us. We make a big mistake when we think that we can fix complex lives with simple solutions. What I'm understanding about resilience is it's a complex set of 9, maybe many more processes. Interventions that work hit multiple aspects of children's lives, of young people's lives. When you get that complexity, it actually seems to work that much better. So, where can I? Let me just kind of give you a quick little exercise here. Think about it from the kids' point of view. They will navigate their way. They are looking for what's powerful in their lives. I mean, this is taken from some of the research. These are file reviews and talking to kids themselves who are quite marginalized. I'm sure you recognize some of these labels that kids carry, right? And I went to a bunch of kids and I asked these high-risk youth, and I asked them, what kinds of labels do you carry in your community? And these are the kinds of words that they said: loser, charity case, brat, stupid, victim, sluts, dropouts, thieves, and little effers. These are the ways that our communities know us. And I thought to myself, wow, that's kind of a crappy list of identities to bring to your lives. And what do you do with that in terms of making yourself more resilient? How do you cope after you get those labels? Well, fortunately, there's a system of helpers like us to help these kids. So, of course, we come along and we add to their list. We give them some hope. We give them labels like conduct disorder, parentified, ADHD, depressed, suicide, borderline, antisocial, bipolar, emotionally disturbed, dysfunctional, resistant, lacking impulse control, or just plain difficult. That's our contribution to their identities, which is kind of potentially maybe or maybe not helpful. So I asked the kids, what do you want to be known as? And the same group of kids that had the files that were this thick with all those words and those community descriptions of them, they said, Mike, we'd rather be known as leaders, toughs, gang members, dealers, sexy, survivors, studs, street kids, helpers, drinkers, or maybe even fighters. And suddenly, it dawns on you, isn't it, that kids will make choices, they'll navigate, they'll negotiate. Let me put this back on you for a second. Do you ever go to an eye examination, and they flip those little lenses in front of your eyes, and they go better, worse, better, worse? Do you ever get to the point when you really can't tell if it's better or worse, and you just say whatever? Honestly, you've done this, right? Let me put you through a quick little exercise. When you see a slide that you think is better as a set of identities that would be powerful and get you through life, you just raise your hand. Better? Raise your hand when you see a slide you like. Better? Worse? Better? No? No? Okay. Better? Worse? Better? Worse? You got to raise your hand at some point. Better? Worse? Raise your hand when you see something you prefer. Yeah, so you are a whole bunch of delinquents. We've already proven that. Okay, thank you. Excuse me. Now, look, there's a theory underneath this, which is simply that people living in very challenging contexts, the kids that we've been working with, they will change when their natural supports, when their programs, when their interventions make it possible for them to navigate and negotiate effectively. It's kind of like this. If you just stop and pause for a second, if you can fill in this grid of questions, think back to a moment in your life where you experienced some sort of challenge. And I'm going to suggest that we are not that different than the people we worked with. That if you can go through the sequence, when I experienced somebody bullying me in grade 7, I coped by what? Running away from it, trying to tell an adult, it didn't work, whatever. My success depended on, usually we have internal resources and external resources. I felt strong, but no teacher or principal ever heard me. Looking back, I think my coping strategy worked well or didn't work very well. You know, and I think we can walk ourselves through the same pattern. The next questions, of course, we need to ask is, other people have told me that my way of coping was, well, kind of ineffective, but then, Mike, you know, I could also ask myself, and I could have used a different coping strategy if, well, perhaps people believe that children were bullied back when I was growing up, or that we believed in child sexual abuse when I was growing up, or we believed in all these problems that only now have labels and names. So I could have used a different coping strategy if this certain resource was available, and if this resource was also accessible. However, compared with other people facing the same challenges as I faced, my coping strategy helped me do as well as others, or perhaps better than others, or worse than others. I walk people through those questions when I'm working with them. Whenever I'm consulting on cases, whenever I'm sort of working with young people directly, I'm asking myself those sequence of questions. I want to understand coping strategies as pathways to resilience inside contexts, which are often not giving young people a lot of different options. So I help people navigate, and of course I also help them negotiate. That seems to be key. But, you know, ultimately, there's a challenge here, isn't there? Because what I'm really getting at is that we constantly have to contextualize what we are actually doing. Those multiple patterns of resilience, those 9 factors I've just listed off, those are all things that we can consider. So when we work with the next young person who walks into our lives, we can say, what is your pathway to resilience? Am I clearly seeing it? How are you getting those 9 factors in your life? Do I understand it? Does it make sense? But ultimately, it doesn't really matter if it makes sense to you. It's about if it makes sense to them. What I will tell you about the research on resilience is that there's not a lot done around the world. There's not a lot of voices in it that don't represent people who look and talk like me. And I love this picture because of course, we were doing work all around the globe. This is actually a picture taken when I started this research, when my daughter came with me to Tanzania, and I was working with my colleagues there, and she went to school with some of the children of my colleagues for a little while. And I went back one lunch hour and I snapped a photo of my daughter and her friends. And my daughter, if you can't pick her out, she's about the 5th girl in from the right-hand side there. I love it. I love the photo just because my daughter is outnumbered on that bench. And what I'm understanding whenever I work in, you know, Inuit communities in the Arctic, in Labrador, or I'm working with children who are recent immigrants from war-torn countries, or I'm working in a place like Sierra Leone itself, what I'm understanding is that resilience is something that's very contextual and that we have to ask much more than tell people. We have to look at why they are resilient and try to understand their own patterns and pathways. And on that note, with that sense of humility to all of this, the sense that we're going to have an ongoing discussion about what resilience is and what makes us resilient, that this is only the beginning, if you will. Let me just simply say again, I really appreciate the opportunity to share some of the emerging ideas that are going on amongst the research team that I lead, and I hope in some small way they've perhaps helped you see your kids, the kids you're working with, much more clearly. All the best with your work.
We're going to take some questions for Michael. And so I believe I have Danielle and Heather in the back with some microphones. There's Heather, waving like a mad woman, not unlike what she normally does. Daniel's the other long-haired beauty over here. It's really hard to tell them apart. Oh, actually, it's Daniel, maybe? I can't, it's so confusing. Daniel and Heather. If there's any questions for Michael, just please ask.
I have one right here.
Yes, I was just wondering, in some of your research, if you had something that we could read upon about relationships that you're creating with youth. Because lots of times I find that workers are making great strides with youth, and then they find a better job. And then our youth are back down to not trusting again, and it's that need to have them continue moving forward and trying to work from where they're at.
You know, it's funny you raise that, because that is such a serious problem in the work that we do, because it's us creating that distrust, right? I mean, I've tried that with my own kids. You know, every 2 years I give them a new parent, but you know, they seem to want to glop onto me for some odd reason. I don't get it personally, but I mean, we can joke about this, right? I don't mean to make light of it, but that's exactly the absurdity of it, isn't it? That we expect them to bond, and then we break that attachment, and eventually they learn how to remain avoidant to our connections. You know, in other parts of the world, it's different, eh? They don't expect the attachment to the workers. In places like Japan, the kids attach to the institution, but not to the individual workers. In places like South Africa, you'd probably be much more about extended family attachments or sort of orphan-friendly communities. In other words, I think sometimes we get very hung up on the attachments to us as individuals. And if you're in an institution that's going to continually burn out kids, you're going to have two things either happen. The kids are going to avoid, which makes perfect sense. It's a protective mechanism. It's a pathway to resilience, I'm going to argue. Or we have to change the culture of that so the kids swim inside more of a tribal culture, a clan. Now, how we do that is not always culturally relevant to us, right? But I am amazed at how much we're stuck in this notion of a hierarchical nuclear family model that says you attach to one caring adult. Many places around the world don't do that. They expect kids to attach to a community of adults. So I raise that as a possibility, but I don't know how to enact it. It's definitely a conversation that has to keep going. It's a really sad truth, isn't it? And then you can see the avoidance strategies of kids. It's a great, great comment. Other questions? I'm looking around my microphone people. It's a bit hard to see hands from up here. It's a really big crowd too, right? It's like intimidating. Yeah. Try being up here. Anyone else?
Do we have any from the web?
I am going to be around all day, and my intention was to, in the workshop and stuff, to get into more discussion as well. So really happy to engage further with the comments in a little more personal and intimate way. It's a little bit so thanks. So again, I'll just simply say thanks.
Thank you.